Coalition. My pronouns are she, they. I'm really proud to be here with other members of our team, Brett and Bobby, who are both organizers with the coalition. And we are very excited today to be joined by some special guests to share some very pertinent information about the Strengthening Local Processing Act, a farm bill, marker bill that we are following at the coalition. So today we're very excited to be joined by Aaron Johnson. He is the program manager for the Challenging Corporate Power Program at RAFI USA. RAFI is based right down the street from CFSA in Pittsburgh. So excited to have Aaron share a lot about this act. And then we are also very excited to be joined by Sarah Blackland, the program director at NC Choices, a program of the Center for Environmental Farming Systems that works to promote sustainable food systems and the advancement of local niche and pasture-based meat supply chains in North Carolina. We are also joined by Lee Menius, the technical program coordinator with NC Choices. And then we're also very lucky to be joined by Janelle Pridgeon with Rainbow Meadows Farm. And she also opened Whiskey Pig Craft Butchery and Deli in Kinston several years ago to share about her experiences as a small butcher and how this act could potentially support her in her work. So I'm going to shut up and I'm going to hand it over to Aaron.
All right, thank you. I'm Aaron Johnson, Challenging Corporate Power Program at RAFI. Broadly, I work on federal policy that would reverse corporate power abuse in the food system and on policies that would empower local and regional food systems. And the Strengthening Local Processing Act is a great example of that type of policy. So let's just talk about it a little bit. You can go ahead to the next slide here. So the Strengthening Local Processing Act has been around for a few years. It's co-sponsored by Senator John Thune in South Dakota and Senator Sherrod Brown in Ohio, and there are a number of other co-sponsors. And it's all focused on increasing the capacity and the proliferation of local small processing for meat and poultry. This current iteration of the act is a marker bill for the Farm Bill and would expand on investments that USDA is already making over the past year or two. Over 80 million that they've invested so far through the American Rescue Plan Act. That text that was in the American Rescue Plan Act was copy and pasted portion of this Strengthening Local Processing Act. So in kind of the COVID response efforts, this act has already had an impact in creating the meat and poultry processing expansion program and a number of other programs that are investing in local meat processing throughout the country. The intention with this act is to create a more steady year-over-year source of funding over the next 5 years through the Farm Bill process, as well as do some other things that couldn't be done in the American Rescue Plan just because of weird nuances with how Congress works. So there's a couple different things the Strengthening Local Processing Act does. One of the key things that it would do if passed in the Farm Bill that would not have been able to be achieved in the American Rescue Plan is some expansions to the standards of how the Cooperative Interstate Shipment Program works and to the amount of cost sharing that the USDA does with state inspection programs. The Cooperative Interstate Shipment Program basically facilitates the interstate trade of state inspected meat and poultry as long as it's up to USDA inspection standards. Not every state is a part of that program. The measures in this bill would incentivize more states to join and would change some of the thresholds of what meat processing plants are eligible to participate in that program. And then the cost sharing is just another federal attempt to incentivize more state inspection programs throughout the country. Some of these things would not necessarily be as relevant to the North Carolinian context since we already have Tamajacan system here, which I won't try to get into the details of. Sarah can explain that much better than me, but essentially already facilitates state inspection at USDA standards. The SLPA will also appropriate $20 million a year for the next 5 years to make grants to small meat processing. This is on the next slide here. And those, some key things to note about those grants compared to the funds that have gone out so far. The way the act is written, I think will distribute that amongst a larger number of smaller plants compared to the larger kind of expansion investments that have been made over the past few years. We've seen grants to expand kind of more mid-sized processors that are in kind of like the $20-30 million range. The cap in the current version of this act is $500,000, and with provision for a lower kind of cost share expectation of a grant applicant for folks applying for $100,000 or less. That USDA can be up to 90% of their funding, and up to 500,000, it's 75% of their funding, which is a change from how some of the previous investment grant structures have been over the past year, which should make this more accessible to like small and very small processors who don't have as much access to that kind of matching capital. So I think that's a positive change from some of the previous versions of the bill in terms of seeing more of those grant funds going to like small, very small local processing operations. And then in addition to that, as we were getting on the call, we were talking about HACCP plans. This is another thing that the act would create a library of small and very small scale appropriate HACCP plan templates and enhanced guidance on establishing a HACCP plan for small processing plants, and would basically direct USDA to do that over the next few years, just to increase the amount of scale appropriate resources for food safety compliance in the sector. And that's, again, another thing that couldn't be done in kind of the appropriations focused American Rescue Plan process. And finally, there's some key investments in workforce development in the meat processing space, both in training programs cited in community colleges and other educational or nonprofit institutions, and then also a grant program to existing small processors who want to create an on-the-job training program that would help them like hire and level up the skills of employees that they bring into their talent pipeline. And those are both, I think, really responsive to what we hear a lot from folks, which is a difficult time keeping a good high quality workforce pipeline for this sector. So that's another thing that this act is trying to address. I would say that as we talk to folks on the Hill, this is one of those bills that it is maybe in that sweet spot of having a broader consensus and bipartisan support around still, which is exciting. So I think that compared to some of the other things out there, this has a more decent chance of potentially being included within the Farm Bill. And obviously, like the broader congressional dynamics are very fraught beyond the Farm Bill process, especially in terms of appropriating new funds. But this is something that there are a decent number of folks on both sides of the aisle that are invested in seeing happen. So we'll see how it goes, but it's definitely a marker bill that's worth signing on and supporting too, because it will increase the resources that are available to the smaller and mid-sized meat processing plants that we want to see be more competitive in the industry. Yeah, any questions for me?
I have one. Typically, the grants do not include, or the grant funding cannot be used for bricks and mortar. And depending on what grant it is, it can't be used for fixed equipment. Now, I know the MPERGs allowed fixed equipment, the MPERG grant. So how would this funding, do you have any kind of indication of what would be allowed under the funding you were just talking about? What would be allowed or not allowed?
Yeah, so some of the provisions in the granting portion of this bill include allowing in terms of fund usage within a grant, the purchase or establishment of facilities, equipment, processes, and operations necessary for an eligible entity to comply with the Federal Meat Inspection Act, which is, I think, a pretty broad legislative language for allowing the purchase of like hard infrastructure. This particular bill is designed to be the kind of investment program that allows like a startup effort to start from the ground up. And then it also allows for the purchase of things like cold storage or transportation services. So it has a pretty broad mandate for what the funds can be used for, in terms of like a federal grant of this nature.
Okay, that was what I was interested in. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Aaron. Thanks for that information. I have a couple of questions. I admit I'm not an expert on these things, but I was wondering if in the grant, are there areas that address sustainability, equity, particularly in the BIPOC community, and workers' environment?
Okay, so there are some provisions within this act for like for there to be preference for investment in business enterprises that are owned or controlled by socially and economically disadvantaged individuals. And that's one of the reasons why this particular bill is the one that we're getting behind. There's a couple of different meat and poultry processing kind of bills in Congress that are trying to do broadly similar things, but with different details. And this particular one has more of a focus on making sure that the investments contained within it are biased towards going towards enterprises owned by folks who have been historically marginalized. So that we see as a positive. Some of those details are also up to how USDA implements it. There isn't specific language that's like related to environmental or climate issues within this particular piece of legislation. There also isn't anything that says that USDA can't take that into consideration. And kind of the way all of this works is oftentimes some of those details are like purposely general within the legislation, and then USDA has leeway in terms of how they implement the program as well. Does that answer your question, or is there follow-ups you have to that?
That answers the question. Thank you. And anything around, you spoke to how difficult it is to maintain workers. And so I was wondering if anything in the work environment can be improved, of course, salary, but other things that we could think of that would improve the work environment and help maintain workers.
In terms of like meat processing plant worker conditions?
Yes.
Not in this act, but there is another bill out there that RAFI also supports called the Protecting American Meatpacking Workers Act. That's been introduced by Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey. That has a lot of specific provisions around line speeds and other worker conditions. So if that's an issue that you are activated about, that would be a great piece of legislation to support and to learn more about. And I can put a link to that piece of legislation in the chat for y'all.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Aaron, is that piece of legislation a Farm Bill marker bill, or is that a separate piece of legislation that needs to move on its own?
I believe that it is a Farm Bill marker bill. Yeah.
Quick question, Aaron. Thank you for sharing that information. Relative to the funding allocated for training and developing workers, have any of that occurred already relative to the community colleges? And if not, what would that look like? And if so, what did it look like?
Sarah, do you remember if there's been any grants out through ARPA on that? I would need to Google quick. I know that there's been talk about it. I'm not positive whether there's been any investments under ARPA in workforce development or not. I'd have to check. Give me a second on that. While I Google that, the way that the bill as written would work is it appropriates, I believe, $10 million a year for both processing plant like worker training programs and for like community colleges or nonprofits to set up like worker training programs for this, and those would be run as a competitive grant process through USDA.
Yeah, last year there was that one-time AFRI workforce development program funds for meat and poultry sector, but that closed last year and is not going to be available specifically for the meat and poultry sector this year?
Yeah, a lot of those like ARPA, like a lot of those programs that started out as ARPA funding, they're like one time only grant runs. So yeah, USDA did one of these. I don't remember a lot of details about how that particular program was implemented, so I apologize.
Well, Aaron, thank you so much for sharing. Definitely really appreciate your level of knowledge on this. And thanks for some really great questions, y'all. But I'm going to hand it over to Sarah and Lee and Janelle to share a little bit more about like on the ground in North Carolina, why this is needed and how some of this funding is playing out already in supporting processors. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Sarah.
Awesome. Sounds great. So thanks, y'all. I'll provide just from the NC Choices view, a little perspective on what we've seen happening in North Carolina within the processing industry, and Lee can certainly plug in if I've missed anything here. But big picture, if you care about supporting local farms or local animal production, local processing is absolutely vital to their business. It seems like an obvious statement, but sometimes we need to remind ourselves because they are not the people that we see or interact with as consumers. So in North Carolina, maybe 3 years ago, a farmer who was selling local meat at, say, a farmer's market or direct in any way would get a slaughter appointment in a matter of weeks, usually about 2 to 3 weeks. And now we're looking at 8 months to a year out for an appointment, and that's actually improved over the past couple of years. But basically, it's largely because a lot more farmers are interested in selling their meat direct to consumer, which is exciting. And this trend surged, of course, during the pandemic, as many of us know. But it's still held on now. So what this means is that these mom and pop processors have had to really pivot quickly to try and accommodate this flood of business. And so that's left a pretty big bottleneck in an already bootstrapped processing industry, which is our small and very small plants. Just as a side note, our local farmers cannot process their meat at large commercial processing facilities. Those are privately owned. So they really depend on what we're talking about, the audience today, which is the small and very small state and federally inspected processors, to bring their meat to market at farmers markets or anywhere to bring their inspected product. So we've been really lucky that we've had these grant funds available through USDA over the past year. In some cases, some states have had state funds like North Carolina as well. But really what we want to emphasize is that processors need much more than one-time funding to support local farms. And I want to give you some examples as to why we think that's so important. But big picture, every bottleneck you relieve in these small businesses just creates another bottleneck, either behind it or in front of it. I think, Lee, you said that yesterday, and I'm like, yep, that's exactly right. So there are numerous challenges that small and very small processors face who service local farms. Again, unlike commercial commodity processors, our small and very small plants are not automated. Most are not automated in any way when it comes to like regulatory protocols or inventory management. Basically, most of that is done manually. So that obviously requires a lot of labor. And these businesses also depend on hundreds of individual farm customers. So they don't have one or two large scale farm customers, hundreds of small scale farmers, many of whom want specific cuts. And that requires added time, requires skilled labor. And that's super difficult to find in today's labor market. And also in these small and very small facilities, employees usually work many different jobs in the plant rather than one repetitive job throughout the day. They are getting pulled between floors and have to, basically these plants really need training for skilled, diverse labor to work in these small facilities. And just like I said, every bottleneck you relieve creates another bottleneck either behind it or in front of it, because these plants are running at full capacity. So that means they need large chunks of capital to really improve their efficiency. They don't just need a new piece of equipment here or there. They need expanded floor plans, a whole new livestock pen, a whole new cold storage unit, and that requires a lot of money. That requires basically a huge level of risk that mom and pop operations just can't afford to do without grant support, which is why continued and comprehensive funding that includes labor, expansion, HACCP support, training is really critical to retooling our existing facilities or creating new ones. I do want to mention that I should recognize that most new small and very small processing facilities that are being built fail. And that's because it's a very high risk business. So it's imperative that we also recognize that we need to support the expansion of existing facilities versus just creating new ones. And sometimes we do need to create new ones. But a new facility, for example, can easily, and I'm talking small and very small facility, could easily cost between like $4 and $6 million. A small, very small facility could take years to build, and then more years to establish the customer base and what we call throughput, but the volume of animals that you need to bring in enough income to cover your overhead costs and your labor every month. So while sometimes a new facility is needed, another thing that's really important is funds to retool and support our existing facilities, because they tend to have a greater chance of really coming online and expanding capacity faster for the farmers in our local food network. Just a couple quick examples. We have a local processor here in Siler City who processes for many of the farmers that you in the Triangle and that area farmers markets in the Triangle, and they're a family-run operation. So their entire family basically runs the plant, and they have some employees who have worked there for 20 years, which is very unique. So they actually have a very strong family labor network in their plant, and yet they still need more trained staff because they received some grant money last year. And after that grant money to expand, they were able to expand, but they actually couldn't take on more customers and expand as they would like without having the people to run a second shift. So they, again, one thing is very much connected to the other in these small businesses. So we need continual support across the supply chain for these small local farms and processors. Another example in North Carolina is a small facility that literally built their expansion, their larger facility over top of their existing. To miss one day of operating and servicing their local farmers who are selling year round. So literally after the expansion was finished, they knocked down the walls and they didn't have any downtime. And that's how these local processors operate. One final example I'll share is that there's another local processing facility that services about 400 farm customers in North Carolina. And they received some grant funds to start a training program to help train and recruit labor, because we don't have these kinds of programs at our nearby community colleges. So as they were doing that, which was a big need, the rails that were holding the carcasses in their cooler fell, pulled out of the ceiling. And that's because they were working in an old building. So we're talking, luckily no one was hurt. They heard the noises, they were able to get out, but they worked day and night to secure insurance coverage at a premium for their customers to pay back for that product. So I guess my point here is that one thing affects another thing, and these facilities need continuous support, both and for small and very small processors to really expand capacity for local farms. Lee, do you have anything else you want to add to that before we hand it over to Janelle?
Yeah, I would say one of the important things with this being a farm bill proposal is that reoccurring funding. Because what we've had in the past is these grants come out and the window of opportunity to pull together a proposal, fill out an application, and get it in is very short. For example, Impact 1, the funds were being talked about in May of 2020. July 2020, July 1st, they announced the grant application. They had worked on the program, and they closed grant applications August 15th and had the awards made by September. That kind of time frame, like Sarah said, one thing bottlenecks another. And so if you get a new piece of equipment to speed you up, that means you empty the cooler faster, or you need bigger packaging on the other side of it to keep moving that throughput and actually result in an increase. And so a lot of times these grants come out with such short windows that it's hard to put together a solid proposal. And then, of course, when you've got changing prices the way they have for the last 2 or 3 years, by the time you get one quote in, 6 months later, that quote may be double of what the original quote was, which is what we ran into with a lot of these grants, is that producers actually ended up going further out of pocket than they'd planned. So reoccurring funding will give them the opportunity to evaluate those needs from year to year, and then make those adjustments and reapply in future years, hopefully. The other thing I wanted to add was with the training programs, and Sarah mentioned the AFRI workforce grant with community colleges last year, and we had worked with some community colleges to look at developing some programs. And one of the challenges there is that all of our processors are really unique. It's not like a large plant for a private owned company that has, hey, I need to train people to do A, B, C, D, and they can develop that. And if you're a meat cutter, you come in, you take that training program, and you're now a meat cutter. Like she said, people are being trained to do lots of different jobs in these plants. And so the individual plant needs can vary a whole lot. And so, it's really important that we get these community college training funds set into place and put in place in a manner to where they can be responsive to the processing plants in their community. And that's one of the nice things about the community college program, is they have a lot of flexibility. But our experience in the past has been it's a real challenge to try to incorporate these type training programs for meat processing into existing programs like the North Carolina Apprenticeship and Workforce Development programs that are already out there. There are just some logistical challenges. They weren't designed for that type of customization. And so, that's another part of this bill that is really important for us moving forward, is to be able to put those type programs together, and then train for what the plants in those communities actually need. And with that, I would like to introduce Janelle Pridgeon, Rainbow Meadow Farms and Whiskey Pig Butchery in Kinston. We've at NC Choices have worked with y'all. I guess I've worked with you in some way, shape, or form since about 2007. So known them for a long time, and they're a family-run operation, which Janelle's going to talk to you about how they've evolved and gotten into the meat processing business and what all of this means for them. Janelle?
Okay, so hey everybody, Rainbow Meadow Farms is now an 11th generation family farm, and we always raise livestock, cows and different stuff. Back in the 80s and 90s on up to about 2003, we went through a period of about 17 years raising contract chickens. My dad did. And we raised tobacco and all that. Back in 1996, we got involved in sheep production. And we started out in 2000. My dad was still raising contract chickens, but my kids had laying hens. We had lamb, and we started selling at the farmer's market. It grew from there. My daddy stopped commercial chicken production in 2003. And so it just grew to where we were back to raising pigs on pasture the way we used to when I was a kid. We were raising chickens out on pasture, turkeys and lambs and all that stuff, and selling at the farmer's market. So we decided that we would, I wanted to have a processing facility. I knew I wanted to do my value added things. That's kind of been a dream of mine for probably about 15 years. And finally, we opened up Whiskey Pig in Kinston. It's just a small butcher shop and deli back in 2000. We've gone through 2 periods of flooding in Kinston. We built it right there near the chef and the farmer. And then we went through COVID and all that. And somehow, knock on wood, we've held on so far. It's been a little scary a few times, when you're trying to do a small startup like that. But we have been very dependent upon upon the small processors. You know, we used to have our chickens slaughtered in Pittsburgh, and then Siler City, and then at one time we were down in going to South Carolina and going to Virginia, and then we finally just backed down on our chicken production and went to the small amount that we could do without having to travel to processing plants. But anyway, that being said, we're very dependent upon those small processing plants, Micro Summit Processors, Acre Station, Chaudhry Halal Meats, and those kinds of places. But that being said, the small farmers, you know, are all competing at the same farmers markets and in the same markets. But with those processors, there is a backup, and it's gotten worse over time, where we have to book a year out on our animals to be processed. And some of those processing plants, if your animals are not ready, then, and you have to back out of that slot that month. So the animals didn't finish out and they weren't ready. You either go and have them processed, you know, say beef, and it's not marbled up enough yet, you're not at your ideal weight, or if you back out of that slot, you're going to pay a fine for backing out of that slot. That's cost prohibitive to the farmer. Then we've had problems with not getting our meat back like we wanted, like it was supposed to be, because of staffing issues and you know, too much turnover of staff and just not cutting it out right. I have had problems where some stuff with my label was at a farm down in Maysville, and they had some of our stuff, and I'm not sure whether we got our stuff back or what we got. And it still took us 6 weeks to get, 5 or 6 weeks to get that product back. You know, time is money. And so my thing with the butcher shop was that I would be able to focus on just all these, what I think are great recipes for sausages, being able to do my own varieties of bacon. We're now doing a really cool beef bacon. We do our own pastrami and all that. But it was to be able to do those unique things, because each farmer kind of needs to differentiate it. These slaughterhouses, they're moving stuff through so quick. They're using those, you know, just bagged seasoning mixes for sausages and cures and stuff. And that's great. But if every farmer's got the same thing, then, you know, why buy from this farmer, you know, versus that farmer? So that was kind of my baby. And that's what we have done. We've got a deli there. We are planning to build another small processing facility, you know, for further processing, and separate out that butcher shop from that deli. We got an MPERG grant, a USDA meat and poultry inspection readiness grant last fall. That gives us 3 years to get our GOI. And right now we're working on HACCP plans and that kind of thing. And we are planning to hopefully build that building. But, you know, we're just kind of watching what's going on with the economy right now. But so the importance of, I feel what I'm doing it, well, one, I don't want to take on the slaughter capacity, because that's another whole basket of problems and environmental issues with waste and stuff that I'm too old to deal with. Don't have the patience for it. So my goal here is to expand the offerings and help a farmer to differentiate. So if Lee came in with his hogs and he had this particular recipe, we could work through that and, you know, get letters of guarantee on spices and seasonings or whatever, help him get that worked out. So he's got something that's totally different from what I'm doing, from what somebody else is doing. And I think those are great offerings. And then also what trip, take it up there, come back and go back and get it. But it will help move the animals through the slaughterhouse quicker, because even if you can kill, you know, 20 animals a day, okay, well then you've got a log jam that happens in that carcass room, and you've got to get that turned around. Or you've got a log jam in your bacon curing room or whatever. The particular thing is the cut and wrap. So I feel like that if you know, if you can break it down into primals or something that can get to me, that the farmer can transport to me under refrigeration, then I can take it and further break it down for him I know it's a little extra legwork, but I've had some possible interest from, I've heard possible interest from some farmers down in the Duplin County area with their hogs, maybe for me to do some stuff like that. And so my goal there is to help move things on through that cut and wrap area of that slaughterhouse and help clear that log jam, as well as give some, differentiation of product. Where we are now, we do not have the capacity to do any dry curing. I don't know that we're going to do like country hams or prosciutto, but I'd like to be able to do some salamis and stuff. And so those dry aged things and coppas and stuff, I don't really have the capacity there to do that. But that's in my long range plans. But these grants are very important because, oh gosh, and I'm terrible with names. I should have looked her name up. She was the undersecretary under Vilsack in the Obama administration, and that's when she come out with the administration came out with a Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food, and that also ties into the Homeland Security. And we're kind of in a time of unsure food security. It may not seem like that right at the moment, but we know we went through that with COVID because there was a real problem with the big slaughterhouses, and there was empty spots for food and limits on the food you could get, meat you could get at grocery stores. So rightly, the administrations have recognized that local food security and local food systems are very important. And for the small local processing plants, even ones with a history who've been in business for 15 or 20 years, it's still hard to get funding, straight out funding, because you're dependent upon 100, 200, 400 local farmers, where, if I went in there and I wanted to build new chicken houses, I could probably get a bank to, even though the margins are not good at all for a farmer. But if I wanted to put up new contract poultry houses, because there's a contract there, you can get that money. Where if you don't have contracts, it's, this as well as anybody, it's harder to get that money. So we're dependent really upon the government doing things like this to allow us to expand, to allow us to see our dream and help build the local food systems that we would not be able to go into a bank and get. And to be honest and tell you the truth, some of the funding that we've had so far to do what we've done is because we were able to go and get our funding through USDA. And it's because my mom and I own it, and we're women, minority, considered a minority as far as farmers go. And we couldn't have gotten, funding straight from the bank to do what we're doing because, it's too risky, like was mentioned earlier. So it's incumbent upon the government to put money in and support these ventures. Because like I tell everybody, food security is homeland security. So I just encourage them to keep doing what they're doing. But it like Sarah said, it's so much more than just pumping dollars for a new piece of equipment. We require, I guess, we don't have the funds, and the back end that these big corporations do, and we probably require a little more hand holding, to be honest. So that's kind of where we are. That's our dream is, is to be able to build that building and then grow from there. Baby steps. I keep telling myself, just keep swimming. So
thank you so much, Janelle. Thank you for sharing and providing your firsthand. You've been in it, you've lived it. And I'd love to know if there are questions from the group.
So I have a question for you, Janelle. So are you having trouble finding skilled labor to help you in your butcher shop, or do you feel like you're still small enough that that you can sort of train people as they come along? And how are you going to handle that if you're going to be doing more cut and wrapping? How are you going to handle that problem, because that's one of I think that's the most exciting. Well, there's lots of exciting things about SLPA, but that to me is one of the most exciting things, because I feel like it makes the act very well rounded, because it's addressing so many different issues. And I know a lot of thought went into it with NCFSAC, and a lot of contributors helped sort of fine tune what exactly was needed. But anyway, just curious.
So yeah, that's a great question. So here's kind of the conundrum or the problem that we have. I am blessed that I have, 3 workers that have been with me a long time, since the start of Whiskey Pig. And so that works well. I've turned over a lot of people, but I'm on my 3rd butcher, but this guy, is actually kin to me. And so he has the vision. So I think, unless something happens to him, God forbid, I hope he's going to be around. But it's hard to compete. I had a really good butcher, Jan, and he had been with Piggly Wiggly for a long time, about 20 years. And then he came to me, he was excited about what we were doing, even though he didn't have the whole carcass background. He was a meat cutter, and he learned, and it worked well. I loved having him, but it is difficult to keep somebody, because when you get somebody good like that, Piggly Wiggly needed somebody to go manage their meat market, and they doubled his pay. I mean, his pay went up to $36 an hour, plus retirement benefits, and I mean that just. And I want to pay an equitable living wage, but I don't get that kind of money, and there's not that kind of money in it for the farmers, and I couldn't do it. And I just told him, I said, I'm going, hey, letting you go. I said, or seeing you go. I said, but I can't do it. It won't pay for itself. And I had to let him go. So it's difficult, because at the end of the day, I'm all pieces of the puzzle, so to speak. So I've then got to go market that meat. And and to be honest, when times get tough, there's certain people that can afford to buy my product. But when it comes down to your electric bill and your mortgage and all of that stuff, you're going to make a choice to eat cheaper. And so that means I'm not going to move as much. And that means that I can't pay that butcher $36 an hour. I wished I could. So, yeah, labor is a real issue. And post-COVID, there's been a lot of people who just didn't want to work. And I know they weren't getting, checks anymore to stay at home. I just don't know what happened to them. I cannot figure that one out. But I'm thankful at this point, I've got a good core team. And I got one guy who left me who I think would like to come back. He went to go help his sister run her restaurant, but he was my associate butcher. I think he'd like to come back, but I don't have the capacity or the money at this point to bring him back. Maybe I can at some point. So that's where I am. I don't know that gives you the answer you want.
It's an honest
that
answer
does.
about
Thank
the
you.
realities of this economy. So we appreciate you being honest.
You're welcome.
Hi, this has been such a fascinating discussion, and I thank each of you for sharing what you've told us today. I was wondering that even though we're talking about the Farm Bill at the federal level, what support or what help or what resources are at the state level, or what barriers are at the state level?
One of the challenges, just to highlight a couple of the challenges that have come out during these grant processes over the last few years is, starting on the local level. One of the biggest challenges a lot of the people had with their expansions, they were given money, given a deadline to do it, and then got hung up with local regulations, getting through county zoning, getting through, just local issues. One plant had to actually, instead of expanding their plant, had to go to a second off-site place because of county rainwater footage on the building was maxed out for the amount of land he had. And even though they tried to have it come up with an engineered solution, that was still an issue, and he had to go elsewhere to expand. And so a lot of these little zoning issues do come up, and a lot of that's regulated to the local, the county, and the municipal governments, town governments and stuff. We've got another processor we've worked with that was actually trying to relocate because of a right-of-way issue with a sewer line going right through the front yard of his plant. And so he was actually expanding and moving off site. And he's been through about 4 or 5 different townships before he found one that was actually friendly to having a slaughter plant come to him. Everybody wants to support this until it comes to your neighborhood. And that's so, having that support and helping educate people on the importance of these, supporting these type businesses can really go a long way. Funding stuff, there's been talk of reoccurring funding on the state level, but so far nothing that I know of has been introduced or put into play. So, the big support is with the consumer support for the local farms and these local markets, and then as well as, just the policy supports and helping support them, get them through local government and local zoning and such.
So Lee, I have a question. There was that, the capacity grant, like the expanding, is the state grant for, like a processing facility, that came through. I went to that talk about it last summer. You think that's going to happen again or what?
So Impact, which was the improving meat processing expanded capacity, something or another, IMPEC, was the 2020 grant that at the time was COVID relief money put into that. There were the Impact 1, 2, and 3. First round was meat handling processors that worked with meat handlers. Second round was processors that worked with meat handlers plus seafood folks. Third round was all of the above plus the value added folks like the country ham and sausages. There was an Impact 4. Those 3 programs were all COVID relief money from 2020, 2021. Impact 4 just closed out and made awards first of this year. This was actually the I'm sure Aaron knows it off the top of his head, the ARC funding,
Right.
U.S. From the federal government, and so that also appears to be a one-time fund. So all these state level programs have been through federal funding that have been emergency funding that got redirected into these programs.
So is our hope that with this farm bill, maybe there'll be some funding that will then come back down into the state to do something similar to that again? Is that what we're hoping?
I don't know. The state legislature, there's been some talk about funding, having a reoccurring funding very similar to what this federal proposal is. But I would say, given just the fun of local politics, this is probably this is probably our best bets coming down through USDA.
Okay.
The programs that would be authorized under the Strengthening Local Processing Act would be implemented by USDA. They wouldn't be like passed through to like the state level to implement. Just to clarify.
Yeah, and I was just going to add real quick. I noticed there was some messages about poultry in the chat, because poultry always gets brought up because North Carolina has a really strong pasture poultry industry, and that's one of the backbones of a lot of our small farms is that pasture poultry. We do have an exemption, federal exemption to the Red Meat and Poultry Inspection Act that allows for on-farm slaughter. Hopefully this funding through USDA would be allowable, it would be eligible to help develop an inspected plant for poultry for these processors to give us another option. Like Janelle said, we've had 3 USDA inspected poultry plants that did work for individuals over the last 25 years, I think, since Andy Youngblood was in business. And so it's been a challenge, and the biggest challenge there is when you think about it, is this a very large investment? Like Sarah said, it can be several $1 million just to open a plant. And with pasture poultry in North Carolina, it's still a seasonal item. And so that adds to the high overhead cost, really makes it tough when you're talking about something that runs 8 to 10 months out of the year. And then on top of that, you pile on the labor issues that shortages we're currently experiencing. And now you've got a workforce that you only need 7, 8, 10 months out of the year. It's going to be extra hard in that environment to maintain adequate labor and trained labor to keep these operating. And so that's been our challenge over the years. And like I said, we've had 3 case studies that have proven what a challenge it is over the last 25 years. And there's still folks working on it, but it's just a tough nut to crack.
And also, adding to what Lee's saying there, the price per unit, the profit per unit is much smaller, and you've got to move a lot more units. And unless you've got a wholesale, enough wholesale to justify, it's hard. I mean, you've got somebody coming with 100 birds here or 200 birds there, and you've got to have a whole lot of those to pay for that plant. Andy fought that fight, and it's just a difficult fight to fight. I mean, like down at Williamsburg Packing in South Carolina, Sep kind of has it where he has like 1 day a week where he kind of handles the pastured poultry or whatever. And he also can be doing, maybe he's just slaughtering poultry that way, but he's doing cut and wrap of red meat, over in another part of the plant. But I mean, it was 4 hours for us to go down there, 4 hours back, then get back on Wednesday and, pick them up and come back. And then you got to distribute. And there just has to be enough capacity flowing through that plant to do that. To be honest, the best option would be for a red meat facility to have the ability to add on to their facility and add a day for poultry or a line for poultry. That's the most sustainable that I've seen. What Sep Harvin has going on down at Williamsburg Packing.
So I have a quick question. This is actually for Sarah and Lee. Is there any talk about allowing the I don't even know the right words. When Ben was able to was able to process for other people, so I guess an exemption. What was it called? I forget what it was called. That's now gone away, right?
That was the special exemption, which was
Special exemption. All right.
As an emergency when Foothills plant closed down unexpectedly.
Yeah. So, but is that likely to come back?
In place for 4 years, but that was a special declaration that was at the discretion of the Meat and Poultry Inspection Director, and really was an emergency declaration that kind of she stepped into a really gray area there to do that for us, and we were lucky it lasted. But yeah, it does not appear to be coming back.
Quick 1 minute question. Janelle, do you grow any of your meat now? And if not, where do you purchase your meat from?
We do. We've got our family farming operation. So we don't raise all of our rabbits and we don't raise all of our chickens, but we are raising, beef and pork and lamb, and turkey and some chicken as well. But kind of getting out of the rabbit thing, I have a neighbor down the road who raises rabbits, and that's kind of their thing. And I have family labor issues too, because we run the farm with nothing but family labor. Lost my dad back at the end of 2019, and I've got a 26-year-old son who is just trying to step up to the bat with that, and he's still got a lot of young'un left in him. And a guy who I'd had for about 20 years that worked for me retired. So pretty much mostly my 26-year-old doing the day-to-day tending the animals. And plus we put up our own hay too. And we have to put up at least 800 round bales of hay to cover the winter. So all summer long, we're struggling with that.
So it sounds like what you don't grow, you purchase from locals.
Yes.
Farms. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Appreciate you sharing your struggles as well as your successes. Very helpful to hear that. Thank you.
Definitely. And we're right before or just turned to 1. I want to respect folks' time. Thank you so much to y'all for being here, and Aaron as well. That was super informative. Yeah, I'm gonna stop